And there we go. So welcome everybody. My name's Boyd and I work for the product team here at Sparx. And I'm here with my colleagues Becca and Merrin from our communications team and Ross from our customer support team. We're starting to see more faces.
Hello.
Give a wave, guys. Excellent. Just a few housekeeping bits and pieces before we make a start. If you want to ask any questions, you can visit this URL that's at the top of the screen here and submit a question there. If you want to, you can submit your questions anonymously. I need to just mention that that URL is a bit different to the one that you would have received in your meeting invite. So if you've opened the URL that was in your meeting invite, you might just want to tap this one in instead. To be honest, as we're a relatively small group, we may well just be able to take question and answer over the voice chat anyway. The intention of today's session, let me move my slides on, is to give you a bit of an overview of Virtual Classroom and to give you guys an opportunity to ask any questions. I think we might have some both Virtual Classroom and full Sparx Maths users in the group here. So just to advise, the key focus of the session is going to be Virtual Classroom, but by all means, if there are any broader Sparx Maths questions, we can either take those in the session or have a follow-up chat with you afterwards. Just a couple of bits and pieces I need to mention. This presentation is being recorded. If you don't want your face on the recording, then please turn off your webcam. If everybody could just keep their mics muted unless you're asking a question, just so that we don't all hear the pets, children, significant others. I'm sure they're all lovely, but and we'll drop each of you a link to the recording afterwards if you want to catch up with anything. Before we make a start, first thing I'd like to say is, well, I'd just like to relay from everybody at Sparx the utmost admiration and respect that we've got for you guys, keeping your learners learning in these unprecedented circumstances. So a massive thank you and well done from us. And we hope that we're at least helping to make things a little bit easier for you, fingers crossed. Feel free to start adding questions to the Q&A site if you want to. Just while you do that, I'm going to give you a little bit of background as to why we created Virtual Classroom. So, as I mentioned a moment ago, we have a product called Sparx Maths that our schools have been using for over 8 years now. Around about 2 or 3 weeks ago, we started to follow the story that was unfolding around coronavirus. And our CEO, Dan Sandhu, had a meeting with the DFE. And through those conversations, it became quite clear that there was a possibility of schools needing to close and for teaching and learning to be delivered remotely. So we wanted to do whatever we could to help schools that were going to be in that situation. And so Sparx Maths Virtual Classroom was born. Sparx Maths Virtual Classroom is actually, we'd see it as a light version of Sparx Maths. So we knew that given kind of the remote context in which teachers would be working with their learners, we needed to make some of the admin processes a bit simpler. So things like in Sparx Maths, we talk to your school's MIS to pull student data and create accounts. When we needed to get remote accounts set up quickly, we felt we needed to simplify that, and therefore students don't have accounts in Virtual Maths. Sparx Maths also has some other features, like we generate bespoke homework for every student every week that looks at the work that they've done in their lessons, and then spots kind of areas of strength and weakness and tailors their homework to them. That isn't included in Virtual Classroom. We wanted to keep the core of Virtual Classroom basically about you guys choosing the content that needs to be delivered, crafting lessons around it and delivering that content. If that is something that might be of interest to your school, if you find a virtual classroom helpful, and you want to talk to us about what else is available in Sparx Maths, then I think our communications team are just going to drop some more information in maybe a couple of weeks' time around that. As I mentioned, we wanted to create a solution for you guys. We assembled a team of, I think it was around about 10 people in the core team that spent a week basically taking the product that we had and adapting it to make it more useful to you guys in the remote teaching and learning context. But broader than that, I mean, we're a team of over 100. We're based in Exeter, and many of that team supported the crafting of Virtual Classroom over that week. And we're really pleased to say that in the last week and a half, we've had a good couple of hundred schools register and now using Virtual Classroom, which is really nice for us to see. So that's it for the intros. Oh, there was one other thing actually, and that was to mention that you may have been aware that we hit a couple of hiccups earlier this week, where the student parts of Virtual Classroom weren't available for a little while. Just wanted to thank you for your patience on that. As per many online services, we've been really pleased but quite overwhelmed with the number of new users that we've seen using the system. And so we've had to make some changes behind the scenes to make sure that we can continue to support our growing user numbers. The issues that we hit earlier this week, we resolved. You may have seen we're also going to be taking the system offline for up to an hour this evening, from 7 o'clock this evening, just to make sure that we've put the bits and pieces in place that we need to make sure that we can continue delivering a nice stable experience. So once again, thank you for your patience on that, and we have a dedicated team to making sure that we continue to monitor and improve on these kind of things. So with all of those bits and pieces covered, I think we will go over to your questions. So I'm just going to check to see whether anyone has submitted any questions. So I'm not seeing anything just yet. Does anyone want to just ask a question face to face?
Can I ask a question? I wasn't able to click on the link actually.
Okay.
In order to submit a question. But I have a question because I have several grade 7 classes and I would like to set them the same lesson.
Yeah.
But I don't want to have them all in one group because I find it's difficult to manage them when they're all in one group. Is it possible to write a lesson and then to duplicate it across classes, or do you have to go into each class and set the same lesson again?
It would need to be a case of either following one of the scenarios that you've described there, creating the lesson multiple times per class, or having one class with all of the students joining it. What I would say though is it may be that you don't want to do that from a monitoring and management perspective, but it is possible to leave lessons running long form. So if you wanted several classes to work in that lesson across a week, for example, you can leave the lesson running for a week. That's not a problem.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I have a question.
Sure.
I think I've tried to use the system for a little while, and I think it's the case that once a student has logged off, I can't see any of their activity unless I end the session. Is that correct, or is there a way that I can see students that have disappeared?
Sure, you should still be able to see a student's activity. So let's just very quickly start a lesson here. Is everybody seeing my screen okay? We'll be seeing Virtual Classroom.
I think more accurately, I can't see the details of their activity once they've logged off, unless I end the lesson, and then it seems that I can.
Okay, you should be able to, but what you might find, I don't have a running lesson here at the moment, but what you'll probably find is once a student's logged out, their detail drops to the bottom of the list and they'll show as logged out. Have you checked to see whether they are appearing further down the class list?
Well, I've got very small classes that they're all visible on the screen at the same time. The student is still there, but I can't click on their activity and get the detail up.
Okay, so in terms of going into their answer history, you mean you can't do that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Correct. And I can't. I don't think I can even get the number of attempts they've made at each question once they've logged out. I just get a broad picture of their activity.
Okay. So what you should, in theory, see is you should still see the row for the student. You should see the colour blocks that signify their corrects and incorrects. So you should still see the number of attempts. We are aware that there's an issue whereby once a student's logged out of a lesson, you can't click on the student's row to then view the detailed answer history until the lesson's finished. You are right about that. And that's something that we're aware of and thinking about at the moment. But you should still be able to see the number of attempts that students have made. As a workaround to this one for the time being, what I'd suggest there is you can tell your students that they don't need to actually log out. If they just close their browser window, that will keep them logged into the lesson, but obviously they don't then have to carry on working on the lesson.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't sure whether that was the case, whether they were actually logging out or whether they were just closing their browsers. But
yeah, if you see logged out as in the student status part, then that does mean that they've actually gone into the user menu and chosen log out. Whereas if they close their browser, that will leave them active in the lesson.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Any other questions?
So I know with Sparx homework, it often says how long the pupils have spent on it, so such as 30 minutes plus.
Yeah.
Is there an option to do the same with Sparx lessons? Because we've been telling children not to finish all the objectives, but to just spend an hour. Is there a way for us to check that they have spent an hour?
There isn't at the moment, but this is one of the things that, given this new remote context within which we're working, we're increasingly seeing requested. So it's something that our support team have heard about a lot, and we'll definitely be considering adding to the product soon.
That's lovely, thank you.
I think we had a question had come in through the URL, so let's have a quick peek at that one. Okay, so the question is, how can we see what content is available? And how can I tell whether it's an appropriate level for my students? If we quickly flip into Virtual Classroom then, first of all, as you're probably familiar with, when you're planning a lesson, the first thing you need to do is search for the topic that you want to teach. We appreciate that the descriptions we may give to a topic may not always align 100% with what would be intuitive to you. So to that end, on the Virtual Classroom support site, you'll all have a link to this in your welcome email. You all probably saw this when you watched the onboarding video. But just in case you haven't got that, it's learning.sparx.co.uk/VC support. And if you scroll down to the Find Out More section, and then just very quickly, he says, need to find which article it's under now. Right, there it is. What topic coverage does Virtual Classroom provide? In that article, you'll find a link to a PDF document that includes a summary of all of the topics that we provide coverage for, and they're organised into their relevant strands and substrands. So it's worth probably downloading a copy of this. That then you can then use that to kind of reference the topics that you want to search for in Virtual Classroom. So for example, here I've got rounding whole numbers. So I can then search for that, rounding whole numbers. And there that topic is returned in search. In terms of, I think the second part to the question was, how can I tell whether it's at an appropriate level for my students? If we search for another topic here, so if we go for angles on a line, angles about a point and opposite angles, you can see first of all that we provide both a Key Stage 3 and GCSE version for that topic. Here I'm working with a Year 7 class, so I know that it's likely the Key Stage 3 version of that topic that I want to look at. We immediately then show you the kind of mid-tier or mid-level of objectives, but you can also browse easier objectives if there are any, and again, harder objectives if there are any. By previewing the questions behind each of the objectives, you can then ascertain whether you feel the questions are pitched at an appropriate level for the class. So let's say, for example, I'll take this objective here, I'll preview the questions. For each objective, we provide core, extension, and challenge questions, so you can navigate through those there, and you can preview each of the questions here. So these are variants of the questions that students are going to see in their lesson if you place this objective into the lesson. So I can assess these. Do I think that's appropriate for my class? Maybe they need something a bit more challenging. So I'll look for an equivalent objective in the harder objectives pot, preview the questions there. Great, yeah, this feels around about the right objective, level for my class, so I'll pop that objective into the lesson. Hopefully that answers the question for you there, but do let me know in the Q&A, on the Q&A site if you need any more detail there. Any other questions? See if we've got any more over at the Q&A site. Okay, I need to add some more teachers. How do I do that? If you set up Virtual Classroom for your school, you will have seen that there was a wizard initially that prompts you to create teachers and classes. It's likely that you're going to need to add more of your colleagues to your Virtual Classroom instance after you've completed the initial setup. So to do that, when you logged into Virtual Classroom, you just need to go to the More menu here, go to Staff Manager. You'll see all of your current staff members listed. So in this school, it's just me. But to add a new one, you just hit Add a New Staff Member here, enter their first name and surname. This will automatically create a username for your colleague. So here we've got end user, pop their email address in. Really important part, which you don't have to do in the wizard or two pieces, tick the send welcome email box here. If you don't do that, they won't get the email that asks them to set their password for their account. So make sure you do that. And also, you just need to assign a role. You can pick any of these, but let's just go for teacher for argument's sake. Then you'd hit save. That sends the welcome email to your colleague, and they can get their account set up then.
If they've, if you set them up initially when you joined, when you using the wizard, do they get a welcome email then? Because I don't think my staff had.
They should do, and if they haven't, if you can, just to check, Ross or Becca, do we have contact details for everybody that's on the call now?
Yes, we will do.
Okay, cool. So we can get in touch with you about that, and we can work out who's not received their emails, and we can look into that for you.
Okay, thank you.
It might just be a case if they've gone to a spam or junk folder, or if not, we can just resend them. But I'll catch up with you afterwards.
Thank you.
Thanks. Boy, just to let you know, there's another in the chat part of Google Meet. There's a question for you here.
Aha, excellent. Hi Richard, I'm completely new to Sparx, experimenting with it at the moment. My students like it a lot, but their progress is not being saved. Once they log out and back, they have to start everything from the beginning. Okay, with Virtual Classroom, one of the simplifications that we made versus full Sparx Maths is we chose not to give students accounts. And that's because it avoids the necessity for us to talk to your school's MIS, to pull data from there, set accounts up for them. It avoids the complexity of you guys having to hand out usernames and passwords to your students. So what we went for instead was the join link approach that you'll probably be used to using. So when you share a join link with your students, we effectively, for that lesson, create a temporary account for them. They just enter their first name and last name. Then for that lesson, they've got a temporary account. You're right in saying that if they log out and rejoin the lesson, they won't see any progress, because if they've logged out and they rejoin, they're effectively creating a second account then for that lesson. What we'd recommend there is that you would tell your students not to log out of the lesson. So let's say students going to do half an hour of their maths work in the morning, half an hour in the afternoon. We'd recommend that they use the join link in the morning. They enter the lesson as normal. They then don't log out, so they don't go into the, and in fact, let me show you this so you can see how it looks from the student's perspective. What we'll do is we'll just very quickly get a lesson started. So let's plan a lesson, and we'll just put, let's go for angles again. And we'll pop one objective into the lesson, and we'll get a lesson join link. And we will paste the join link in. So I'm now going to join this lesson as a student. So at this point, I'm entering my first name and last name, and when I press submit, an account is being created for me. I can then go ahead and start answering questions. Let's say then I want to take a break, and I'll come back to this later. Instead of going into the menu here and logging out, I can just close this browser window. Then if I want to revisit the lesson later on, using exactly the same link as my teacher sent me before, I can go to that link. Sparx will remember that I was part of that lesson earlier on, and it will log me straight in, and any progress that I've made will be preserved. If I press the log out button, I won't then be able to re-enter the lesson with the same account effectively, and therefore my progress won't be preserved. Hopefully that makes sense, but if it doesn't, or if you've got any further questions, then feel free to pop that in the chat. Okay, is there any way the links could be shorter? It's a really good question. It's a very sensible question, and I am going to make a note on that, because as I saw that link there, I thought the same myself. So leave that with us. What are the ways I can support students who are finding the lesson difficult? Okay, so a couple of things that we can look at here. First of all, as we saw earlier on, we very often provide versions of an objective at different levels. So one option that you might have is, let's say you've taken a mid-tier objective. You can always start another lesson around the same objective, but you could pick an objective at an easier level. So let's say I've started a lesson with find angles on a straight line around a point already, and then I decide that there's a subset of students that need something more foundational. I could choose the lower attainment objectives here, finding angles on a straight line and finding angles around a point, and I could share that join link with those students. You would have to monitor those as two separate lessons then, but it would allow students to access content that's potentially more accessible for them. So that's one option. What I'd also suggest you consider, I mean, it's probably likely the case that this already makes sense, but I just want to very quickly explain the structure of our objectives, just so it's clear that we wouldn't necessarily expect every student to be able to answer every question in the objective. As I mentioned earlier, our objectives are comprised core, extension, and challenge questions. The core covers the key learning points for this objective, and we would hope, if the objective's been correctly pitched to the class, that pretty much every student in the class should be able to answer every question correctly. They might need a bit of support from the tutorial videos that we offer, but ultimately they should be able to answer those questions correctly. The extension is intended to give students more practice on the key learning points. So it's going to be a similar level of question as you see in the core, but it just allows them to do more practice on those learning points. The challenge, these are questions that are designed to stretch your more able students. So we're going to be asking them to further explore and apply the key learning points. If your students are saying that they're struggling to answer questions, it may just be worth checking that they're not trying to answer the challenge questions, because naturally for some students, we may not expect them to be able to answer those. You might also want to give direction to your class as well. So you might want to say, guys, I only need you to complete the core and have a go at some of the extension questions, for example. Whereas your more able students, you might direct them to complete challenge. And the final thing I'd suggest on this is, it's probably obvious already, I'm sure you're all aware of this, but just in case you're not, for every single question that we present to students, we offer a tutorial video. So if they're getting stuck, we'd suggest that they watch the tutorial video for that question. Without giving them the answer to the question, this is going to step the student through how they should approach answering this question. And for many students, this will help them to unstick themselves. I hope that answers the question, but again, if it doesn't, or if you've any follow-on questions, then please throw them into the chat. What I'd also say is, if you guys want to, so you can preview the questions that each objective covers, as we looked at a moment ago in the lesson planning screen. But if you want to have a look at the videos that we offer for each of the questions, there's nothing to stop you guys once you've started a lesson from going in as a student. As I've just done, you can use that join link. You can just join the lesson as yourself, and you can then preview the videos. So if a student says to you, for example, oh, the video's saying this, and I'm not quite sure what to do next, you can then watch the video and work through with the next steps with them. Any more questions? Oh, another one come in. Is there a tracker to see what is the most difficult question for my actual class in the assigned work? There's not a tracker per se. However, what I'm just going to do now is I'm going to log into a full Sparx Maths school. This is a demo for a full Sparx Maths school. And the reason that I'm doing this is I've got some realistic lesson data that we can talk through to demonstrate what you might do here. Just to call out, as you're probably noticing, there's more to see in full Sparx Maths. As I mentioned, there's homework aspects to it. But the lesson monitoring side of things is largely the same. So I'm just going to dive into a lesson that I've already got running here. If we dip into this one around fractions. Okay, so what you're seeing here is a typical lesson monitoring scenario. You'll be used to seeing this from your virtual classroom lessons. Just very quickly to summarize what we're seeing here, then, if it's not clear, anything that's red, the student has attempted that question, they've answered it incorrectly. Anything that's green, they've answered correctly. If you've got a number in a square, that means, or that's the number of attempts they've made at that question. So here I can see this student's attempted this question 3 times and they've still got it incorrect. So that's a sign of a potential struggle there. And the blue video symbols here indicate that the student has watched the video for the question. So to the specific question that's been asked here, is there any way to track what the most difficult question is? It's worth mentioning that each column, we're looking at the same skill for every student. So they're all getting kind of the same question, just a different variant of the question. And the reason we do that is usually in a classroom scenario where you've got students sat next to one another, we don't want them to be able to copy from one another. So they're all going to get slightly different variants of the same question. But because this covers the same skill, what this allows you to do is to identify patterns of struggle. So you can see here for the first question in the core of this objective, 4 students have got the question incorrect, and 3 of those seem to be significantly struggling. They've made multiple attempts and they've still not got the question correct. So that's a good indicator that there's probably some common struggle there, and therefore you might want to issue some further support to the class around those around that skill. What you can also do there is if you dip into the answer history, you'll see an example of the question that's been asked. So if you want to quickly run through an example with the class, for example, if you have a mechanism for remote teaching, you could throw this up on your screen and talk through the class with it, or you can screenshot this and email an explanation out to the class, for example. I'm just going to check, see if we've got any other questions over at the Q&A site. So it was asked, when I'm running a lesson, what do the blocks and numbers mean? I think we've just covered that in my explanation here. One thing that I didn't mention is this symbol here. So basically, we're going to show you this if we feel there's a significant struggle. And what that means is a student has got a question wrong at least 3 times. So you can see here, we've got it's the seek help flag, as we call it. And the number 1 indicates that there's one question that a student seems to be significantly struggling with. Let's say this second question here, the student had answered incorrectly 3 times as well. This would say there are 2 seek help flagged questions. Any other questions? Feel free to pop them in the chat, shout out, pop them on the Q&A site. Okay. Sounds like we've gone quiet now. Oh, there is another. Is there a way for students to seek help via the platform? Can I message them directly? There isn't, no. I think if we'd had more time to put Virtual Classroom together, this would have been an obvious thing that we want to have included. Because this is built upon Sparx Maths, which is typically used in a classroom scenario, students can just pop their hand up if they're in this place. So there isn't any kind of messaging capacity in Virtual Classroom. And what we recommend there is you just encourage your students to use your school's recommended communications channels. Be that some schools are using Microsoft Teams, for example, or just email or something like that. And of course, you can proactively monitor the lesson as well using the lesson monitoring screen. And perhaps we just encourage you to check in with students who are either seek help flagged or where you're seeing patterns where you feel they might be struggling and not shouting out. Definitely something that we want to think about for the future, though. Any other questions? Okay, before we close then, I just want to check with Ross, Becca and Merrin to see whether there's anything else that needs to be covered.
Another question's just popped up.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay, where there are questions for which the answer is, I have done this, is it possible to give them a box to put their answer in? That's a really good question. If I just explain in full Sparx Maths how this would work, and then hopefully it makes a bit more sense why we've got questions like this. With full Sparx Maths, and indeed for Virtual Classroom, we would hope that students maintain bookwork alongside the work that they do in Sparx. So as they're working through their Sparx questions, we would ask them to write down their workings and answers in their book before they enter their answer into Sparx. By keeping bookwork, obviously we're preparing them for exams. They're going to be expected to demonstrate their workings there. It's also a useful diagnostic tool, as you guys know, for yourselves and for the student to work out where students have gone wrong. So we'd ask them to keep bookwork. In full Sparx Maths, we have a mechanism called bookwork checks, which, as the name suggests, checks whether students are maintaining a sufficient standard of bookwork. Without going into too much detail, we give them a code for every question. They write that in their book. Periodically, they're spot checked. We say, okay, for that code that we gave you, what answer did you give? If they can answer that correctly, great. If they can't, they're told to reattempt the question. So because students are keeping bookwork, for those kinds of questions that you've highlighted there, we'd expect them to be writing this down in their book, and then the teacher would be spot checking that that's happened. We don't have any mechanism at the moment for students to be able to demonstrate that they've done that in the product. It is something that we're currently thinking about. It's more complex than it might seem on the surface to come up with something that's simple and doesn't create a huge amount of work for you guys. So I'm not saying that we're going to have anything soon on that, but it's definitely something that we are actively pursuing at the moment. So that's great. And I've asked my students to photograph their work, but they don't know which box to tick. Cool. Okay. Well, that's really exciting that you're asking the students to photograph their work. And that makes us very happy to hear that. But they don't know which box to tick. Can you just clarify for me what you mean there by which box to tick? I'm going to see if I can create a lesson that contains one of these questions so I can bring this to life for everybody. So I think equivalent fractions. Have a look. Okay, so yeah, here we've got an example of one of those questions. So I'm going to create a lesson that contains that objective. Let's get the lesson link. Definitely need shorter URLs. Thank you for that one. Okay. And it should be item A. Okay, yeah, so here's an example of this kind of question that students are going to see. In your book, copy and complete the image. Find the number that replaces the question mark in the equivalent fractions. So here we'd expect the student to copy this into their book and solve the question. When they go on to answer this question in Sparx, this isn't one of those questions, my apologies. If it were, what? Oh.
The situation I've come across is when students are asked to criticise a diagram and they're given a choice of things to tick and then asked to do one more of their own. And I find that they're ticking a couple, sometimes the correct ones, but then they're not quite sure how to. They're given the choice, I have done this or I have not done this, and they get a bit lost in the process.
Okay. What basically that question to them is just them affirming that whatever we've asked them to do or explore on the previous screen, we're just asking them to affirm that they've done that. So assuming that they have done that, they should always just choose, yes, I have done this. That's going to then mark that question correct. If they choose, no, I haven't done this, that's going to mark the question as incorrect. So on the lesson monitoring screen, you'll see a red square for that one. So as long as they and you are satisfied that they've done the right thing there, they should just press, yes, I've done this. Again, this is one of those situations that it works more smoothly in a classroom context, and over time, as we evolve virtual classroom as a remote teaching and learning product, this is the kind of thing that we'd want to look at improving. Does that make sense?
It does. I think it would be simpler for the students if they didn't have a box that said, no, I've not done this, because they get a bit lost.
I completely agree. All I can suggest there at the moment is if you just message to them that as long as they're satisfied, they've done what they need to do, they should just press, yes, I've done this. And if they're also taking photos of their bookwork as well and sending them that, to you, then, I mean, that's perfect. And that's almost that's something that would encourage them to make sure they have done the right thing and not just press, yes, I've done this. Yeah, I think you're handling that situation in as perfect a way as you possibly could. What we'll also do there is we'll pop a clarification in the FAQs on the support site around this. So I've not been able to demo what this looks like to those of you that haven't seen this. We'll get an example screenshot of this kind of question on there, and we'll pop some suggested guidance that you can issue to your students in the FAQs. We'll get that up later today.
Thank you.
No problem. Any other questions? So I have none in the Google Meet chat. No new ones in the slides. So again, just to check, Ross, was there anything else you think we need to cover?
No, I think you've covered everything brilliantly. Oh, one more question.
Excellent. I found your product from the Hegarty Maths homepage. Is there a partnership between you and Hegarty? Really good question. The simple answer is yes, there is. So Hegarty Maths and Sparx Maths are part of the same family of companies, Sparx. We joined forces towards the end of last year. For those of you that are familiar with Hegarty Maths and indeed Colin Hegarty, Hegarty now sits on the board of Sparx Maths. Dan, our CEO, sits on the board of Hegarty Maths, and yeah, we work together. Sparx Maths and Hegarty Maths are still two separate products, and for the foreseeable future, we still intend them to be separate products. No problem. One thing that I think we spoke about earlier, Ross, that might be worth me mentioning is we've heard from a few customers that there's a little confusion around logging in sometimes. So with Virtual Classroom, you receive a welcome email, and that contains your link to your teacher portal. And as we covered earlier, for every new teacher that you set up, they receive a welcome email with a link to teacher portal. Students don't log in. They don't have accounts, as we had covered earlier on. They just use the join link that you email to them. What some customers and their students have been doing is popping along to the Sparx homepage and following the login links here. So these login links are intended for full Sparx Maths, not Virtual Classroom. So if your students were to follow this, for example, they're going to be asked for a username and password, which, as we mentioned, they won't have. If your teachers are following the link from the homepage, they're going to be seeing a school selection page. And because this is listing Sparx Maths schools primarily, your school might not be listed there. So if ever there's any question in your school around how do I log in, it's for teachers, follow the link that's in your welcome email. For students, you only ever need to use the lesson join links that your teacher emails to you. It's probably worth mentioning that if you do end up on this screen, for some schools based in the UK, you will find your school in this list and you will be able to log in that way. So if you've been able to do that and you're wondering why I'm saying what I'm saying, it will sometimes work. But for simplicity's sake, we just say follow the links in your emails. So if there are no final questions, I'm just going to do one final sweep. No, looks like that's everything. So I guess to close, I'd just like to once again thank you all for everything you're doing for your learners. It's hugely admirable. I certainly couldn't do what you're doing, so massive thank you and well done. And thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending your lunchtime with us. I think the intention is to have more sessions like this in future. If you haven't done so already, there's a Facebook community group for Sparx users. I'd encourage you to seek that out and join that as well. And finally, as I mentioned, if you're interested in continuing to use Sparx at such point that schools reopen, we'll be sending you a bit more information about Sparx Maths a little later down the line. So thank you very much and have a fantastic rest of your day, everybody. Take care.